All right, good day, everybody. Modern World History class. Thank you for checking in with this special edition, this abbreviated special edition of Modern World History lessons. I will try to keep this brief. I know that you didn't sign on for added work on top of the pounding I give you every week in class. I have fallen behind a little bit, so all I'm going to do today is wrap up the Cold War section, get my thoughts on that out of the way. I'll give you the secret word near the end so you can write that onto your homework or send me an email. Let me know that you saw this presentation. And then this upcoming Thursday, no fooling, April 1st, I will be back. I will be back. And we'll talk about Chapter 18, the movement of these colonial territories into nation status. So we'll be tracking some of the emerging world countries to see how they're doing and how it's going in that part of the world coming into this modern period. All right, so just sit back. I'm going to try and keep it to 10-15 minutes as if I were in class, only better. And then on Thursday, we'll be all caught up and able to move ahead. I'm going to share my screen. And that means you should be able to see the PowerPoint presentation. I got this far last time. Two differing political philosophies in play here. Let me bring up the two. And this is what I started out talking about in class a week ago Thursday, that there's any different number of ways to actually run and guide a government, but there's really only one way to justify it. And this is the different ways that they run their governments in this period, in the Cold War period. We have the Western capitalist notions of the United States, Canada, the English-speaking world, Western Europe, generally speaking. And then we have the Eastern or communist philosophy of Stalin in the USSR, Mao Zedong in China, and certain other parts of the world that have come under their influence. And they have two very, very different ways of going about securing their obtaining their security and making sure that there's no other big war. They still all want to prevent a big war, but they both want to win. They both want to be the dominant side and to be on the winning side. The Western side is something that should be quite familiar to you. The weed of democracy has grown and taken strong root across most of Western Europe. We've turned back the threat of fascism, at least in the 1940s. And they declare as their enemy not so much the entire people of Russia, of China, of other nations like that, but only the autocratic governments that are preventing those people from having their own autonomy and expressing themselves in a democratic way. Whereas the communist bloc spoke to you might think, a more pragmatic point of view. Look, we're a great power. We can destroy the whole world if we're not happy. If we feel that we're being threatened, we now have the military might with the atomic bomb and the jet fighters and the large navies and all. We can destroy the world. We can have another world war if we don't feel secure. So we get to do what we want in order to feel secure. Buffer zones around our borders. With China, it's places like Tibet and Southeast Asia. With Russia, of course, it's Eastern Europe and certain parts of the Far East, what we would call the stans, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, those places. We get to have those under our thumb. We get to control what happens there so that when our enemies attack us, they have to come through hundreds of miles of buffer zone. And since they won't do that, then we'll be happy. And if we're happy, then those smaller countries are happy, because what could be worse than a big world war coming to your doorstep, like a Poland in World War II. And the enemy from the communist point of view are these monopolist, capitalist running dogs, yes, who control so much property, which is completely contrary to the communist vision. But the way they discuss their regimes, Stalin and later Khrushchev and Brezhnev and Mao Zedong and leaders who come after him, is still the same way as the United States and the Western Europeans discuss the backing of their peoples, that they are popular, that they do allow choice. They wrote it into their constitutions. I showed you a slide last time of how the words of the Soviet Constitution look like they're plagiarized from the US Constitution. They're so close. There's some more slides at the end of this presentation that you can look at. I think you find them interesting. I won't go over them today, but they're in a kind of appendix at the end, and I'll send you this slide deck, the whole thing, when we're done. So what are the consequences of having these differing political philosophies now squared off and fully in a state of Cold War. Most of you identified very clearly and correctly what Cold War is, that without the actual shooting, there's a state of hostilities similar to war between these two sides, the West and the East, the capitalist or democratic and the communist. And diplomatically, economically, socially, there's just a gigantic division between them and a very hostile attitude. So once again, we're back to maintaining enormous permanent military forces, always trying to keep up. Militarism continues to influence the world. It's not so much based on a nationalist idea that, you know, the Germans have to have the biggest army, or the French, or the Poles, but that there is a constant need to be prepared to contribute in the case of the ultimate conflict, and that will scare our opponents. Since we're so prepared, that will scare them into not risking war. The nuclear weapons, of course, raise the stakes of this kind of arms race tremendously. The explosive power of the hydrogen bomb that comes along after the atomic bomb is just unthinkable. And the two sides are stockpiling thousands of them, thousands of them. You'll see in texts and other articles that we have the ability to destroy Russia's population 100 times over. It's just tremendously in excess of what's needed. But we had to have more missiles than they did. That was the only thing that really mattered. And that was the only thing that would really intimidate them. On the other hand, we also return to this notion of limited war, which is aiming only at containing expansion. The United States particularly pursues this notion of just keeping it cool enough. You also hear the phrase proxy wars or buffer zone conflicts. So US and Russia are not directly fighting each other, or China, but we are backing opposite sides in certain conflicts. And our goal in the West is to just contain the spread of communism. The idea of the domino theory, that if one nation falls, then the next one, the next, and the next, you know, right across the map, is very popular, and a lot of people believe in it. Whether it's actually true or could ever have been true, not sure. You only get to try these things once, and the US, of course, tried to contain the growth of communism as much as they could. Mutually assured destruction, getting back to the enormous destructive power of these weapons. The idea that it was all on a push button, the president has his football, and if the Russians launch, our radar detects it, our planes detect it, and within just a few minutes, we can be launching our missiles back at them. So even though they would be destroying our cities and devastating our country, there'd be no way to stop us from retaliating, because there's no way to neutralize or shoot down a nuclear missile in the 50s, 60s, 70s. So mutually assured destruction, mad. It's a mad, mad world was the phrase that the sarcastic journalists would use. That's what's going to keep us from having this third world war. And that in turn leads to something that President Eisenhower warned about, the idea of this permanent, very powerful partnership between the military, which always needs the new weapons, and the industry, which is going to produce them, very much as if you're still at war. It's a very powerful partnership of always finding the next most lethal, next new thing that can threaten our enemies and therefore guarantee our safety better. And working with the industry to get that done leads to a lot of lobbying in government and things that I think we are very used to now. We hear about large arms manufacturers, the big military lobby and the big industrial lobby, and this is where that really emerges. There really is never a peacetime for us to wind down and significantly tool away from developing the next best fighter or the next best naval ship or a faster missile or whatever the case may be, the military industrial complex. Okay, so as I said, there are indirect conflicts in which the United States and its allies in the UN don't directly fight Russia, but we fight one of their proxies, one of their puppet states, and we hold up a state of our own, and each side fights through them and supplies the two different sides. In Korea, on the left side of your slide, a conflict that lasted for the better part of 4 years, in which our goal was limited war. President Truman wanted to just stop the North Koreans. They were the ones who initially tried to invade the South and take over all of South Korea and convert the whole thing into a communist state, just to stop them from being able to do that. And we actually reversed fortune so quickly and so well that we were looking like we were going to conquer North Korea for a while. But then the communist Chinese came in on the side of the North Koreans because they did not want to tolerate a free democratic state on their borders. They wanted that buffer zone. That's part of the philosophy that they're ascribing to. So they sent enormous amounts of manpower in to help the North Koreans. And now we were kind of directly fighting the communist Chinese. And that led to a stalemate. It was our better weaponry and logistics versus their numbers. And we really didn't get anywhere. They finally decide to just draw the line where it had been on that 38th parallel to keep North and South divided. And they remain divided, and they remain technically in a state of war to this day. They've agreed to a truce, which is a temporary cessation of hostilities. It's been going on for almost 70 years now, but they are not technically at peace. And the idea of unifying the Korean Peninsula seems as distant today as it did then. One of the most significant developments from our point of view, as you can see in the picture below, is the development of the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, MASH, if you've seen the show or the movie. The idea that helicopters and ready deployment and entire hospital units that could move from place to place quickly to get closer to the action would get wounded soldiers to treatment faster, to triage the more serious injuries quicker, and a big jump in the number of lives that are saved. There's injuries, of course, there's deaths, of course, but it's a great innovation to use the power of the helicopter to land at the front, load up a wounded soldier, get him to a mobile hospital in just a matter of minutes, instead of jouncing along in a Jeep or something over very bad terrain and taking hours and hours. It makes a huge difference in the survival of soldiers from the Korean War. And then in Vietnam, at about the same time, the North Vietnamese, who have been under Ho Chi Minh and influenced by communist theory, have been pressing to bring South Vietnam under their control. This was a French province coming out of the war, and the French, as you may remember, were much more direct and inflexible in their control of the colonies. They tried to continue pumping money out of the colonies to pay back for their debts. Their country was shattered by World War II, and they had no intention of letting any part of Indochina become independent. But the North Vietnamese found Ho Chi Minh very persuasive. He was very popular, and he was actually even popular in South Vietnam. So gradually, the French lose control of the northern part. And this is where the domino theory comes in. The United States realizes that France is about to abandon its defense of Vietnam altogether. And so they kind of step in to try and keep the communist wave from spreading. They think it will go to Cambodia and Laos and Thailand and so forth, right across the Southeast Asian peninsula if they don't. So we end up getting entangled in a war starting in the early 60s. We pick up sort of the second half of this war, very unpopular in the United States. Both wars very unpopular because they don't seem to be about winning. They just seem to be about holding and containing. And Americans don't understand that. They said, we beat Hitler, we beat Mussolini, we beat Tojo. Why can't we beat these guys? It doesn't make any sense. And so it was very difficult to explain and justify these conflicts. The picture there is also very emblematic. It is a very famous, really hard to watch kind of photo, hard to look at. Here's a South Vietnamese army officer on the left executing in the open street a suspected Viet Cong North Vietnamese spy or saboteur. He's concluded that the man is guilty. There's no trial. There's no internment. There's no process. He is living in South Vietnam, but he's gone over to the enemy. And so he's just going to be shot. And you see this last instant before the bullet goes off, that man is going to be killed. And there's a lot of that happening in Vietnam. Americans can never tell whether the smiling Vietnamese face near them is a friend or an enemy. And it leads to some massacres and some terrible tactics. And again, just horribly unpopular with people back then. I was a kid. I was 6, 7, 8, 9 years old in the late 60s. So this was something that tore a lot of people apart. We didn't like talking about it. We didn't actually do very well by our soldiers when they came home. We didn't honor them. We didn't thank them for their service as we typically do now. It was the cause of a lot of grief and conflict in the US as well as there. We didn't do so well. By 1976, it was clearly hopeless. Several presidents had tried different tactics, including Richard Nixon, and none of them worked. So the US eventually evacuated South Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese took over. It is a thoroughly communist nation today, but it is opening its doors a little bit to trade and some more capitalist, or not democratic, but more capitalist notions, allowing for trade and prosperity. Vietnam's an important country in Southeast Asia today. So let's play a little gotcha, right? As I said, they have these two different governing philosophies. They're both trying to say the same thing about why they're in power. And that leads both sides to situations where you're going to get caught in a sort of hypocritical position. What you say doesn't turn out to be what you do, right? When China split into a civil war, the US forwarded its notion based on Wilson and its Western philosophy that the people should choose the new leader of the country. And they supported Taiwan and barred Mao Zedong's China from having any kind of representation in the UN. Well, the people of China clearly went over to Mao Zedong. They clearly picked him. Chiang Kai-shek was confined to the little island of Taiwan off the coast, and the US was stuck continuing to insist that Taiwan was not only the UN representative of China, but that it was the Security Council member. It needed to be on the Security Council, whereas the rest of communist China, representing over 1 billion people, could not have any seat at all at the UN. And the Soviet Union just, stood there and held their arms out to the world, like, you see that, look at this is crazy, right? And they call us bad guys. Look at this hypocrisy. But at the same time, the Soviet Union, which is trying to spread the support of the international communist movement, is trying to take over the world. They're helping the North Koreans arm for war against South Korea. But at the same time, because they're upset about what's happening in China, the USSR decides to just walk out of the UN and boycotts the Security Council for several years. And as a result of that mistake, it really is a mistake, the UN was able to pass resolutions to fight back against the aggression of North Korea. Right now, North Korea can be portrayed as the invaders and the aggressors, and a UN force, which was very largely made up of US soldiers, but there were British, there were Australians. Again, if you've seen MASH, they're always bringing in, this exotic soldier, a Turk or an Australian or someone from anywhere in the world who's fighting on behalf of the UN against the North Koreans. And so now the US looks like the heroes, and they have a UN resolution telling them that that they're here to fight communist aggression, and it makes the communists look bad. I talked about the Vietnam conflict. There's my cat, of course, demanding attention. I talked about the Vietnam conflict, where we were supposed to defend freedom of the world, but what really happened was we got involved in a very unpopular cause. The South Vietnamese governments that we tried to prop up declared themselves to be capitalist and democratic, but they were actually quite corrupt and just as autocratic, if not more so, than the governments under Ho Chi Minh, the hero of all Vietnam. And so we really had no hope in the 15 years that we committed ourselves to defend Vietnam. We had no hope, and we eventually had to evacuate. So we got stuck in a quagmire, a waste of money, a waste of lives, making the US look bad, making us look like hypocrites for supposedly supporting democracy, but really not supporting the one who was popular in that country. And in almost exactly the same way, in the 70s and 80s, the Soviet Union, which ascribes to this notion of having buffer zones around its border, they get involved in Afghanistan, where lots of countries have gotten involved over the centuries, have all tried to conquer this rocky, ferocious, independent tribesman terrain. They've all failed. And so the Soviets get involved in a quagmire, which lasts for about 15 or 20 years before they end up pulling out. The Mujahideen are the heroes of Afghanistan, but they're not exactly capitalists. They should have worked it out. Honestly, the Mujahideen should have easily been able to set up some kind of an arrangement with communist Russia, but they found themselves on opposite sides, and the Soviets committed to trying to conquer Afghanistan for far too long. And the same thing, waste of money, waste of men, looking bad in the eyes of the rest of the world, and eventually having to leave. So it's such a weird situation that the two sides are involved in a strong conflict that comes right up to the edge of them actually directly shooting each other, but never quite gets there. And in the service of what they keep saying, as opposed to what they do, in terms of what they say, they end up embarrassing themselves all the time. Both sides do embarrass themselves all the time. They look like hypocrites, and world opinion is strongly divided. And to some extent, it remains the case today. We still have lines drawn between what we call the West and Russia and China and certain other nations in the East. But over the course of the 60s, 70s, and especially into the 80s, while these brush wars do continue, where we're proxying and supporting one country or other as it's having a little problem with its neighbor or a civil war, even so, conditions do begin to thaw. Stalin dies, that's a big plus. And Khrushchev and Brezhnev coming along afterwards, they do begin to say a few things about possibly opening up, cooling it a little bit with all the hostility. Richard Nixon, of all people, I'm sure you know the name as the man who was involved in the scandals of Watergate, and he was not a very savory character. He was a lot of things, complicated man, paranoid, crude in many ways. The tapes, the secret tapes of Watergate were very shocking to people because he had such a potty mouth. He was swearing all up and down the yard, and people really didn't think that was presidential behavior. But Nixon did take tremendous steps to move forward with China, to try and establish some kind of relationship with China, and also even with the Soviet Union. As the space race went on and America pretty clearly won the race to the moon, we did begin to talk about the International Space Station, doing some collaboration in ways that would benefit both of us, not hurt either of us, advance the understanding of science, a little bit of warming of relations. A big breaking point came with what we call Star Wars and its evil empire. It was so easy to make this joke. The first Star Wars movies came out, and then Ronald Reagan, the president in the 80s, very popular, won both elections rather easily. He started talking about new weapons in space platforms, space lasers, if you will, and weapons that were just far beyond anything the Soviets could respond to. And he was talking casually about committing billions and billions of dollars to the space race with these new weapons platforms. Now, he never actually developed them, but it caused a kind of crisis in the Soviet Union because the Soviets have actually been straining to even pretend that they're keeping up with the US over the years. They're really not nearly as wealthy as the US is, the industrial might of the country, and many other ways. They're just not able to compete with the tremendous power of the US, but they've been trying to keep up. And when Reagan lays out this grand scheme to spend dozens of billions of dollars and make these platforms that could shoot down missiles and completely expose the Soviet Union as defenseless, that's when there's real turmoil in the Soviet Union. People have had enough. There's not enough results. They're still suffering. They can't get basic groceries and things like that in the stores oftentimes. They have no freedom in their daily lives. This totalitarian state for 2-3 generations, they've just had enough. And so we do begin to see détente and a warming of relations. It's not all chummy by any means in a few years, but little things happen along the way. The Soviets stopped trying to compete so directly with us in terms of military might. As I said, we never actually developed the space platform, the Star Wars platform. We do continue to cooperate with the space station and at the Olympics and certain other things that allow for that kind of friendlier relationships to start. One big thing that happened, certainly in terms of my generation, for the Berlin Wall to be torn down after all this time, that led to the reunification of Germany. Very shortly after that, the country had been divided for nearly 50 years. I got to do the math before that time. And now the Berlin Wall comes down, very symbolic. The world celebrates, Germany reunites, and something that really will blow your parents' mind. You can go home and say, do you know, Mom and Dad, it's been longer since the Berlin Wall was torn down than it's been since the Berlin Wall was put up. And you can just watch their brains start to squeeze out their ears. It'll be a lot of fun. Do it at dinner tonight. But it was from 19 47, 47 to 91 is 44 years. And it's been longer than that since 91. That's the math I've heard. But at least it gets them thinking. So things do begin to improve a little later in the period as we get closer and closer to the year that you were born, for example. We're getting there. Not yet, but we're getting there. I'll give you the study sheet. And as I said, there are other sheets here that will talk about the sayings, the constitutional sayings of the day that I think you might find interesting, because everybody really is justifying their governments in exactly the same way. These are the terms, and some of them you've already answered on your sheets and in your take-home quiz. But I'll try to have copies of this ready for you, and I'll send you the slides up to this point with the appendix. The secret word is Zanzibar. Zanzibar is a secret word. So put that on your homework or send me an email. We're all caught up now on the Cold War. We'll start with chapter 1 that comes after the Cold War. I think it's 18 on Thursday. I appreciate your patience, and I'll send you these slides. Take care.